The cold October wind swept through the gardens of Ashbourne Manor as Eleanor Hartwell adjusted the final details of the dining table. Her fingers worked with precision, folding white linen napkins into elegant shapes. The candlelight reflected off the silver cutlery, creating small, bright points that danced on the dark wood-panelled walls. Eleanor was 23 years old and had worked as a governess at the manor for nearly 2 years. She came from a middle-class family that had lost everything when her father's business failed. The position at Ashbourne Manor was not what she had imagined for her life, but it paid the bills and allowed her to send money to her mother and younger sister in London. The mansion was a Victorian colossus with over 200 years of history. Its corridors stretched like labyrinths, connecting rooms that seemed endless. The walls were decorated with portraits of stern-looking ancestors, and the smell of beeswax and ancient wood permeated every corner. Eleanor knew every room, every secret staircase, every hidden corridor. It was her job to ensure everything was impeccable. The Duke of Ashbourne, Alexander Thornton, was a 35-year-old man who rarely smiled. He had lost his wife 5 years earlier under tragic circumstances that no one on the estate dared mention. Since then, he had become a ghostly figure in his own home, spending days locked in his study or riding alone through the misty fields surrounding the property. Eleanor only saw him occasionally. When their paths crossed in the corridors, he simply nodded and moved on. His grey eyes seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 sorrows, and his rigid posture kept everyone at a safe distance. The other servants said he would never recover, that his heart was as cold as the mansion's stones. That evening, however, would be different. The Duke was hosting a formal dinner for the first time in years. 20 members of the local aristocracy would come to celebrate Lord Pemberton's birthday, an old family friend. Eleanor and the other servants had worked tirelessly for days to prepare everything. Mrs. Whitmore, the head housekeeper, inspected the table with critical eyes. She was a robust woman of 50, with greying hair pulled into a tight bun and a perpetually serious expression. "This is acceptable, Hartwell," she said, which coming from her was high praise. "Make sure the wine bottles are at the correct temperature. The Duke is particular about such things." "Yes, Mrs. Whitmore," Eleanor replied, making a small curtsy. The first carriages began arriving at dusk. Eleanor watched from a second-floor window as ladies in silk dresses and men in tailcoats descended from the vehicles. The sound of laughter and animated conversations echoed through the entrance hall, a welcome change from the heavy silence that normally dominated the mansion. The Duke received his guests with polite cordiality, but Eleanor noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes constantly scanned the environment as if searching for an exit. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit, and his dark hair was combed back, revealing a broad forehead and angular features that could be considered handsome if they weren't so severe. Dinner began at 8 o'clock. Eleanor and the other servants served course after course: asparagus soup, smoked salmon, roasted lamb with herbs, plum pudding. The guests conversed animatedly about politics, business, and social gossip. The Duke participated politely, but Eleanor could see that his mind was elsewhere. It was nearly 10 o'clock when Eleanor was sent to the library in the East Wing to fetch a specific bottle of cognac that Lord Pemberton had requested. The library was located in an old part of the mansion, far from the main dining hall. She took a candle and followed through the silent corridors, her steps echoing on the marble floor. The library was her favorite place in the entire property. Tall shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound books. A large stained-glass window offered views of the gardens during daylight. Now only her candle illuminated the space, creating dancing shadows among the shelves. Eleanor found the cognac in a special cabinet and was about to leave when she noticed a strange smell. Smoke. Her heart raced. She followed the smell to one of the walls and felt heat emanating from the wood. Something was burning on the other side. Before she could react, flames began emerging from under the door, connecting the library to an adjacent room. The fire spread with terrifying speed, climbing up the velvet curtains and reaching the shelves of dry, ancient books. Within seconds, the entire room was engulfed in orange flames and thick black smoke. Eleanor ran to the main door, but the intense heat forced her back. The flames already blocked the only exit. She tried to open the window, but the decorative iron bars were firmly attached. The smoke burned her lungs, and her hands trembled as she desperately searched for another way to escape. Her eyes watered, and the room spun around her. She could hear distant screams from other parts of the mansion, the sound of people running, the chaos the fire had unleashed. But here, trapped in the burning library, Eleanor was completely alone. Her strength began to fail. The smoke was too dense, the heat unbearable. She fell to her knees, coughing violently, and then collapsed on the cold marble floor. Her last thoughts were of her mother and sister, of everything she still wanted to do in life, of unspoken words and unrealized dreams. Then, through the fog of her fading consciousness, she heard a strong voice shouting her name. Alexander Thornton was in the dining hall when the first cry of fire echoed through the corridors. For a moment, everyone froze, guests looking at each other with confusion and growing alarm. Then the smell of smoke hit the hall, and panic set in. "Everyone out, now!" Alexander commanded with a firm voice, taking control of the situation. He directed his guests to the main exits, while servants ran in all directions, some trying to fight the fire with buckets of water, others searching for valuable objects before it was too late. Mrs. Whitmore appeared beside the Duke, her normally composed face now marked by panic. "Your Grace, all the guests are safe, but we cannot locate Miss Hartwell. No one has seen her since she was sent to the library." Alexander's heart froze. The library was in the east wing, exactly where the fire seemed to have started, judging by the dense smoke now filling that part of the mansion. Without hesitation, he tore off his coat and ran toward the flames. "Your Grace, no, it's too dangerous!" Mrs. Whitmore screamed behind him, but Alexander had already disappeared through the smoke-filled corridors. As he approached the east wing, the heat became almost unbearable. The flames consumed Persian rugs, licked at walls lined with floral wallpaper, destroyed family paintings that had survived generations. The old wood of the mansion was perfect fuel, and the fire spread with voracious fury. Alexander covered his mouth and nose with his shirt sleeve and pressed forward. His eyes burned with the smoke, and each breath seared his lungs. Unwanted memories assaulted his mind. Another night, another fire, another time when he arrived too late to save someone he loved. "Eleanor," he shouted, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "Eleanor Hartwell." He reached the library door and found it engulfed in flames. Using all his strength, Alexander kicked the door repeatedly until the wood gave way. A wave of heat hit him like a solid wall, almost knocking him backward. Inside, through the curtain of smoke and fire, he saw a fallen form on the floor. Eleanor lay motionless, her black governess dress covered in ashes, her face pale and lifeless. For one terrible moment, Alexander thought he had arrived too late once again. But then he saw her chest rise slightly. She was still breathing, even if barely. Without thinking of his own safety, Alexander crossed through the flames. The heat burned his skin, and pieces of the ceiling began to collapse around him. He reached Eleanor and took her in his arms, surprised by how light she was. Her face was marked with soot, and a small cut bled on her forehead where she must have struck it when falling. Even unconscious and in mortal danger, there was something deeply vulnerable and beautiful about her that touched something inside him that he thought had died long ago. "Hold on," Alexander murmured, though she couldn't hear him. "I'll get you out of here." The way back was even more dangerous than before. Part of the ceiling had collapsed, blocking the route he had used. Alexander had to improvise, following a side corridor that led to the servants' quarters. The flames pursued him, consuming everything in their path. His right arm burned where the fire had touched it, and his vision was blurred by smoke. But he kept moving forward, holding Eleanor firmly against his chest. She coughed once, a weak and wet sound that nonetheless brought hope to his heart. Finally, after what seemed like hours, but were only minutes, Alexander emerged into a wing not yet touched by the fire. Servants and some guests who had remained to help rushed toward him. "Call a doctor immediately," Alexander ordered, his hoarse voice unrecognizable. "And someone bring fresh water and clean towels." He carried Eleanor outside the mansion into the fresh night air. The scene outside was one of controlled chaos. The guests' carriages had been moved to a safe distance, and local residents had joined the servants, forming a human chain, passing buckets of water from the well to the burning mansion. Alexander gently laid Eleanor on the damp grass, away from the smoke. Her eyes remained closed, but she was breathing more regularly now. He brushed some strands of brown hair from her face, his fingers trembling. He didn't know if from exhaustion, fear, or something more. Dr. Morrison, who was among the dinner guests, knelt beside them. He was an elderly man with experienced hands and a gentle gaze. "Step aside, Your Grace. Let me examine her," said the doctor. Alexander reluctantly stood up, watching anxiously as Dr. Morrison checked Eleanor's vital signs. Behind them, Ashbourne Manor continued burning, its windows glowing like demon eyes against the night sky. Years of history, memories, and tradition were being consumed by the flames. But for the first time since losing his wife, Alexander found that he didn't care about material possessions. All that mattered was the life of the young woman lying on the grass before him, someone he barely knew, but for whom he had risked everything. "She will survive," Dr. Morrison finally announced, and Alexander felt his knees nearly buckle with relief. Severe smoke inhalation and some minor burns, but nothing that time and proper care cannot heal. "It was a miracle you found her in time." "Your Grace." Eleanor began to cough, her eyes slowly opening. She looked around confused, trying to understand where she was. When her eyes met Alexander's, she froze. "You're safe now," Alexander said softly, a gentleness in his voice that no one had heard in years. "Everything is all right." Tears began running down Eleanor's soot-covered face, leaving clean trails on her ash-stained cheeks. "The mansion," she whispered with a hoarse voice. "I'm so sorry, Your Grace. I tried to save the documents, but—" "Forget the documents," Alexander interrupted, his voice firm but kind. "Forget the mansion. None of that matters. You're alive. That's what matters." Eleanor stared at him in disbelief. The Duke of Ashbourne, known for his coldness and emotional distance, was looking at her with an intensity that made her heart race for reasons that had nothing to do with the fire. Mrs. Whitmore appeared with blankets, wrapping one around Eleanor's shoulders. "Oh, my dear girl," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "We thought we'd lost you." Other servants gathered around, their faces showing relief and concern. Eleanor realized then how much these people, who had become her second family, truly cared for her. Tears flowed more freely now, a mixture of trauma, relief, and overwhelming gratitude. Alexander remained standing nearby, watching over her like a guardian. His clothes were ruined, his face blackened with soot, and Dr. Morrison noticed the burn on his arm. "Your Grace, you need treatment as well," the doctor said. "I'm fine," Alexander replied curtly, though the pain in his arm was considerable. "Take care of Miss Hartwell first." As the night wore on, the fire brigade from the nearby village arrived and managed to contain the blaze before it consumed the entire structure. The east wing was completely destroyed, but the main sections of the mansion could be saved with extensive repairs. Eleanor was moved to the groundskeeper's cottage, a small but comfortable house on the edge of the property. Dr. Morrison insisted she needed rest and observation for at least a week. Alexander personally ensured she had everything she needed: fresh clothes, nourishing food, books to pass the time. Over the following days, something unexpected began to happen. Alexander visited Eleanor daily, initially to check on her recovery, but soon their conversations extended beyond polite inquiries about her health. They talked about books, about life, about dreams and disappointments. Eleanor discovered that beneath the Duke's cold exterior was a man who had suffered greatly, but still possessed a keen mind and unexpected warmth. For his part, Alexander found himself drawn to Eleanor's intelligence, her resilience, and her genuine nature. She didn't treat him with the artificial deference of the aristocracy or the fearful respect of the servants. She spoke to him as an equal, challenging his views and making him laugh, something he hadn't done in years. The servants noticed the change in their master. He smiled more. His steps seemed lighter, and the heavy sadness that had surrounded him like a cloak began to lift. Whispers spread through what remained of the household about the Duke's frequent visits to the groundskeeper's cottage. 1 week after the fire, Eleanor was well enough to leave the cottage. The burns on her hands had healed, and though her lungs still felt tender, Dr. Morrison declared her out of danger. She insisted on returning to work, despite Mrs. Whitmore's protests that she needed more rest. The mansion presented a heartbreaking sight. The east wing was a blackened skeleton, open to the sky where the roof had collapsed. Workmen were already assessing the damage and beginning repairs, but it would take months, perhaps years, to restore Ashbourne Manor to its former glory. Alexander had moved his operations to a study in the west wing, one of the few rooms that had escaped damage. Eleanor found him there one morning, surrounded by papers and correspondence. He looked up when she entered, and his expression immediately softened. "Miss Hartwell, you should be resting," he said, standing up. "I've rested enough." "Your Grace," Eleanor replied, "I came to thank you properly for saving my life. I owe you everything." Alexander walked around his desk, stopping a respectful distance from her. "You owe me nothing. Any decent person would have done the same." "But you risked your life for a servant," Eleanor said quietly. "Not many men of your position would do that." A shadow passed over Alexander's face. "I've lost too much to fire already," he said, his voice heavy with meaning. "I couldn't bear to lose another life to those flames." Eleanor understood then that he was speaking of his late wife, the tragedy that everyone whispered about, but no one dared discuss openly. She took a small step closer. "May I ask what happened to the Duchess?" she asked gently. Alexander was silent for a long moment, and Eleanor thought perhaps she had overstepped. But then he began to speak, his voice low and filled with old pain. "Catherine, my wife, died in a fire at our London townhouse," he said. "I was at my club that evening. By the time I received word and rushed home, it was too late. The servants had all escaped. But Catherine had gone back inside to save her jewelry box, a family heirloom. The stairs collapsed, and she—" His voice broke. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I blame myself for years," Alexander continued. "If I had been home, if I had paid more attention to her, if I hadn't been so consumed with business matters, the guilt nearly destroyed me. That's why I came to Ashbourne, to escape the memories. But they followed me here." "It wasn't your fault," Eleanor said firmly. "You couldn't have known what would happen." "Couldn't I?" Alexander's eyes met hers. "I was so wrapped up in my own world, in maintaining appearances and managing estates, I forgot to truly see the person right in front of me. When you were trapped in that library, for a moment I was back in that townhouse, helpless and too late. But this time I could do something. This time I could save a life." The raw emotion in his voice moved Eleanor deeply. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm, a gesture that would have been unthinkably forward just weeks ago. "You did save me," she said. "You gave me a second chance at life. That means something. Your grace. It means you're not the helpless man you think you are." Alexander looked down at her hand on his arm, then back up to her face. The distance between them suddenly felt charged with an energy Eleanor didn't fully understand but couldn't deny. "Alexander," he said quietly. "When we're alone, please call me Alexander." Eleanor's breath caught. For a duke to allow such familiarity with a governess was extraordinary, even scandalous, but she found herself nodding. "Alexander," she repeated, and his name on her lips felt both strange and right. Their relationship evolved over the following weeks in ways that defied every social convention. Alexander began seeking Eleanor's opinion on the restoration plans for the mansion. She had a practical eye and understanding of how the household functioned that proved invaluable. They spent hours together going over architectural drawings and discussing which rooms to prioritize. But it wasn't just work that brought them together. They took walks through the autumn gardens, talking about everything and nothing. Alexander showed her parts of the estate she'd never seen, a hidden pond where swans nested, an old folly from his grandfather's time, a hilltop with views stretching for miles. Eleanor felt herself falling for him, even as her rational mind warned her of the impossibility of it all. He was a duke, she was a governess. Their worlds were separated by an unbridgeable gulf of class and expectation. Yet when she was with him, those barriers seemed to dissolve. Alexander, too, found himself in unfamiliar territory. He had loved Catherine, but theirs had been an arranged marriage between families of similar standing. What he felt for Eleanor was different, more raw, more real, more chosen. She challenged him, made him laugh, made him think about the world differently. One evening, as they sat in the library that had been hastily set up in a salvaged room, Eleanor reading aloud from a novel they both enjoyed, Alexander made a decision. He couldn't fight his feelings anymore, and he couldn't ignore the way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching. "Eleanor," he interrupted her reading. She looked up, surprised by his serious tone. "I need to tell you something," he continued. "These past weeks with you have been the happiest I've felt in 5 years. You've brought light back into my life when I thought I'd live in darkness forever. I know the difference in our positions makes this complicated, perhaps impossible, but I need you to know that I have deep feelings for you." Eleanor set down the book with trembling hands. "Alexander, I feel the same way," she admitted. "But you're right, it's impossible. The scandal alone would ruin both of us. You would be ostracized by society, and I would be dismissed as a fortune hunter." "I don't care about society," Alexander said fiercely. "I've played by their rules my entire life, and what has it brought me? A loveless marriage, years of loneliness, and a life half-lived. With you I feel alive again." But I care about your reputation," Eleanor replied, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I care about what this would do to you. You've already suffered so much." Alexander stood and crossed to her chair, kneeling beside it so they were at eye level. "Then let me decide what I'm willing to risk," he said. "I'm not asking you to marry me, not yet. Not until I can figure out how to navigate these social waters, but I am asking if you feel what I feel, if there's a possibility for us." Eleanor looked into his grey eyes, seeing the hope and vulnerability there. She thought of everything she'd been taught about knowing one's place, about the impossibility of crossing class boundaries. But she also thought about how he had run through fire to save her, how he had shown her kindness and respect, how he had made her feel valued as a person. "I feel it," she whispered. "Whatever this is between us, I feel it too." Alexander took her hand in his, pressing it gently to his lips. It was an old-fashioned gesture, but it felt charged with new meaning. They sat there for a long moment, hands clasped, knowing that they had crossed a line from which there was no return. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering the scarred landscape of Ashbourne Manor in a blanket of white. It was as if nature itself was offering a fresh start, a clean page on which new stories could be written. The winter months brought both challenges and unexpected joys. The restoration of Ashbourne Manor proceeded slowly, hampered by harsh weather and the extensive nature of the damage. Alexander threw himself into the project with renewed energy, but his frequent consultations with Eleanor didn't go unnoticed. Mrs. Whitmore approached Eleanor one morning in late December with a concerned expression. They were in the temporary kitchen, and the head housekeeper carefully closed the door before speaking. "Miss Hartwell, I feel I must speak plainly," she began. "The staff has noticed the Duke's particular attention to you. I've served this family for 30 years, and I care deeply about His Grace's well-being. I need to know your intentions." Eleanor felt her cheeks flush. "Mrs. Whitmore, I assure you I have done nothing improper. The Duke has been kind enough to seek my input on the restoration. But I'm not accusing you of impropriety," Mrs. Whitmore interrupted gently. "I'm asking if you understand what you're dealing with. The Duke is vulnerable right now, emerging from years of grief. If you don't share his feelings, it's kinder to make that clear now rather than later." Eleanor met the older woman's eyes. "And if I do share his feelings," Mrs. Whitmore sighed, "then you both face a difficult road. Society will not look kindly on a duke courting a governess. There will be scandal, gossip, people who try to tear you down. You need to be prepared for that." "I know," Eleanor said quietly. "I've thought of nothing else. But I can't change how I feel. And I don't believe he can either." To her surprise, Mrs. Whitmore's stern expression softened into something almost like approval. "He's different since the fire," she admitted. "More like the man he was before tragedy struck. If you've brought that back to him, then perhaps you're exactly what he needs. Just be careful, both of you." The conversation stayed with Eleanor for days. She had been raised to understand the strict boundaries of class, the rules that governed who could associate with whom. Breaking those rules meant risking everything: her reputation, her livelihood, even her family's standing. She sought out Alexander in his study one evening, needing to have a difficult conversation. He looked up from his work with the smile that now came so easily when he saw her. "Eleanor, I'm glad you're here. I wanted to show you the plans for the new library. The architect has incorporated safety features that will prevent another fire." "Alexander, we need to talk," Eleanor said, her serious tone immediately capturing his attention. He set aside the plans and gave her his full focus. "What's wrong?" "We need to think about what we're doing," Eleanor said carefully. "The servants are talking, and soon word will spread beyond the estate. Have you really considered what that means for you?" "I've thought of little else," Alexander replied. "Eleanor, I'm not naive. I know that pursuing a relationship with you will cause scandal. But I've also come to realize that I've spent too much of my life worrying about what others think." "But this isn't just about what others think," Eleanor argued. "It's about practical realities. If you're ostracized by society, what happens to your business connections, to your political influence, to your ability to help the people who depend on you?" Alexander stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered grounds. "You're right," he said after a moment. "I have responsibilities beyond my own happiness. But I also have a responsibility to live authentically. My marriage to Catherine was arranged for social advantage. She was a lovely person, but we were never truly in love. I've been given a second chance at genuine happiness, and I don't want to waste it.